At 4:17 p.m. on July 20th, 1969, humanity was seconds away from disaster. Neil Armstrong had less than 15 seconds of fuel remaining and alarms were flashing across the guidance computer. The surface below Eagle was covered in massive boulders. One mistake would end the mission instantly. But to understand how humanity reached that moment, hovering above the moon with the world holding its breath, we have to go back 4 days earlier to the morning of July 16th, 1969. At precisely 9:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time from Launch Complex 39A at Cape Kennedy in Florida, the massive Saturn V rocket ignited. Standing 363 feet tall, taller than a 36-story building, its 5 first-stage engines unleashed more than 7.5 million pounds of thrust, shaking the ground for miles around as it lifted slowly, steadily toward the sky. On board were Commander Neil Armstrong, Lunar Module Pilot Buzz Aldrin, and Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, strapped tightly inside the command module they had named Columbia. For the first 12 minutes, the rocket carried them upward and outward, shedding its stages one by one, until finally it placed them into a stable parking orbit, 118 miles above the Earth. After 1.5 orbits, the third stage engine fired once more, propelling Apollo 11 out of Earth's orbit and onto the 3-day journey toward the moon. For the next 72 hours, the 3 astronauts traveled across the silent blackness of deep space. They conducted routine checks, made course corrections, and watched as the blue and white sphere of Earth gradually shrank behind them. Ahead, the grey, pockmarked face of the moon grew ever larger and more detailed. By midday on July 19th, they reached their destination. At 1:21 p.m., the service module's main engine fired for nearly 6 minutes, slowing the craft just enough to slip smoothly into an elliptical lunar orbit, circling between 69 and 195 miles above the surface. Over the next 12 hours, they adjusted their orbit down to a near-perfect circle 60 miles high, carefully mapping the landing zone they had targeted. It was a wide, relatively flat plain known officially as the Sea of Tranquility. They were preparing themselves for the descent that would make history. The day of the landing itself, July 20th, began early for the crew. At 1 p.m. Eastern Time, Armstrong and Aldrin floated through the connecting tunnel from Columbia into the lunar module, the fragile, insect-like craft they had named Eagle. They spent more than 45 minutes powering up its systems, running checks, and donning their bulky pressure suits, while Michael Collins remained behind in Columbia, continuing to circle alone. At 1:46 p.m., the hatch was sealed, and at 1:50 p.m., the 2 craft separated gently, drifting apart as Collins turned Columbia to give them a clear view before moving away to circle high above. At 3:08 p.m., with Eagle positioned behind the moon and out of radio contact with Earth, its descent engine fired for the first time, a burn lasting nearly 12 minutes, slowing the craft and dropping its orbit until it began its long, sloping fall toward the lunar surface. It was during this critical phase that tension began to spike. At 3:41 p.m., roughly 7.5 miles above the ground, the guidance computer suddenly began flashing warning codes, first 1202, then 1201, signals that it was overloaded with too many tasks all at once. Back in Mission Control in Houston, controllers worked frantically to interpret the alerts, while the astronauts stayed calm. Within moments, Lead Guidance Officer Steve Bales gave the go-ahead. The computer could safely continue to fly the craft. But barely had that danger passed when Armstrong noticed something far more concerning. The automatic navigation system was steering them straight toward a large, boulder-strewn crater, its slopes littered with rocks as big as cars and houses, far too dangerous to attempt a landing. Without hesitation, Armstrong took full manual control, gripping the flight stick, and began guiding Eagle himself. For one long, agonizing minute and 40 seconds, he flew the craft horizontally, skimming just 500 feet above the rough terrain, searching desperately for a smooth, clear spot. Mission Control WAD calling out the remaining fuel levels, 60 seconds, 30 seconds, 15 seconds left. Every heart-stopping count bringing them closer to the limit. Finally, at 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time, with barely 15 seconds of fuel remaining, Armstrong spotted a wide, level patch of dust and rock and eased Eagle gently downward. Its 4 foot pads touched softly onto the surface, and at once his voice crackled clearly through the speakers all around the world. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." In that instant, Mission Control erupted in cheers, men leapt from their consoles, and millions watching on television breathed out in unison. The most dangerous part of the mission was done, and humanity was safely on another world. For the next several hours, Armstrong and Aldrin remained inside the module, running through post-landing checks, powering down systems, and preparing for the extravehicular activity. Though the original plan called for them to rest and sleep first, they requested permission to begin their walk early, too full of excitement and nerves to wait. Mission Control agreed, and the countdown to the first step began. At 10:39 p.m., Armstrong slowly began to open Eagle's hatch, cranking the wheel until it swung fully outward. He carefully edged his way backward onto the small, narrow porch, then turned and started down the 9-rung ladder. Pausing on the very last step, he lowered his left foot until it made contact with the fine, powdery lunar soil, soft, grey, and clinging to his boot. At 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time, he spoke the words that would echo through all history. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Minutes later, Aldrin joined him, descending the ladder to stand beside his commander, and together they began to explore this strange, silent new world. The sky above was pitch black, even though the sun shone bright upon the surface. There was no air, no wind, no sound at all, only the crunch of their boots in the dust and the crackle of their voices over the radio. They found the gravity so light, just 1/6 of Earth's, that moving felt almost like floating, allowing them to bound and glide across the ground with surprising ease. Over the next 2 hours and 31 minutes, they carried out every task exactly as planned. At 11:41 p.m., they unfurled and planted the American flag into the lunar soil, taking care to rig the pole so it would appear to fly in the windless vacuum. They spoke briefly to President Richard Nixon, who called from the White House in what he described as the greatest phone call ever made. They set up the early Apollo scientific experiments package, a seismometer to detect moonquakes, a laser-ranging reflector to measure the exact distance between the moon and Earth, and instruments to study the stream of charged particles from the sun. They carefully collected 47.5 pounds of rock and soil samples, stowing them in sealed boxes to bring back to Earth, and fixed a stainless steel plaque to the leg of the lunar module, bearing the simple message, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." All the while, 60 miles above them, Michael Collins circled alone in Colombia, passing out of contact behind the moon every 2 hours, fully aware that if Eagle's ascent engine failed, there would be no rescue, and he would have no choice but to return home alone. At 1:11 a.m. on July 21st, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed back into Eagle, sealed the hatch, and began to repressurize the cabin. They slept fitfully for a few hours, exhausted but exhilarated, before beginning preparations for departure. At 1:54 p.m., the ascent engine roared to life, lifting the upper stage of Eagle smoothly from the surface, leaving the lower half and their footprints behind forever. Within minutes, they had climbed back to orbit, and after 2 hours of careful maneuvering, they rendezvoused and docked perfectly with Columbia. Armstrong and Aldrin floated back through the tunnel to rejoin Collins, bringing their precious samples with them before Eagle was jettisoned, left to crash silently onto the lunar surface. At 12:56 a.m. on July 22nd, the main engine fired once more, breaking free of lunar orbit and sending them speeding back toward Earth. The journey home was smooth and uneventful, the three men watching as the moon shrank behind them and their blue home grew steadily larger ahead. Finally, at 11:35 a.m. Eastern Time on July 24th, the command module re-entered the atmosphere, streaking as a brilliant fireball through the sky, its heat shield reaching temperatures of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Moments later, 3 massive orange and white parachutes deployed, slowing its fall, until at 12:50 p.m., it splashed down gently into the calm blue waters of the Central Pacific Ocean, just 15 miles from the waiting recovery ship, the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. Within minutes, Navy divers attached flotation collars and helped the astronauts into a special quarantine raft, where they donned biological isolation garments before being lifted aboard the carrier and sealed inside a specially built mobile quarantine facility, where they would remain for 21 days to ensure no unknown lunar organisms were brought back to Earth. Every moment of that incredible journey, from the thunderous liftoff in Florida, through the tense descent and that unforgettable first step to the safe splashdown 4 days later, stands as one of humanity's finest achievements. It was not merely a victory in a space race, but proof that with courage, skill, and determination, human beings can reach far beyond what seems possible. Those footprints left in the dust of Tranquility Base will remain undisturbed for millions of years, a silent, permanent reminder of exactly what unfolded on that remarkable day, and of how far we are capable of reaching when we dare to aim for the stars.